Good morning, everyone. I'm Shirley Borghi. I'm a senior executive with TruBiz, domiciled in Dunwoody. I'm also the executive director of the Hispanic Health Coalition. Most importantly, I'm a proud member of the Dunwoody Perimeter Chamber. I would like to welcome all of you to the Dunwoody Perimeter Chamber's opening and our special keynote for the Return to the Workplace Post-COVID-19 series. The Dunwoody Perimeter Chamber would like to thank Cox Enterprises for their generous support as a knowledge expert level sponsor for the Chamber's Return to the Workplace Post-COVID-19 series. Since this is our Chamber's opening keynote, we thought it was only fitting to invite a highly respected stakeholder of our community as our keynote. I would like to introduce Dr. G.P. Bud Peterson, President Emeritus and Regents Professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He is also a member of the Technology Hall of Fame, class of 2017. With that, it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Peterson. Bud, welcome and thank you for joining us. My first question is, given all of your accomplishments, how did you end up at Georgia Tech and why was that your choice?
Well, thanks, Shirley. It's great to be here. Great to be with you this afternoon. Val and I actually grew up in Kansas, and she moved from Seattle, Washington, and my family moved there from California, but we grew up in Kansas and met our freshman year at Kansas State University. We got married before our senior year, and so we were married our last year in college. When I graduated, went to work for Black & Veatch, but I wanted to continue my education, and so while I was working full-time, I pursued a master's degree. Got a master's degree, and then I was fortunate enough to be able to get a job at Texas A&M in one department, on the faculty in one department, while I was able to work on a PhD in another. I was 29 when I started my PhD, and we probably wouldn't let people do that today, but was really fortunate to be able to do that. Spent 20 years there in a number of positions, administrative positions. Had an opportunity to work as a visiting research scientist at NASA and spend a year at the National Science Foundation, and then 6 years at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in upstate New York as the provost, and then 3 years at Colorado, University of Colorado. And then I was really fortunate enough to be able to come to Atlanta in 2009 as the president at Georgia Tech, and did that for the past 10 and a half years.
Well, we were
I moved around a lot, but it doesn't feel that way.
We were just as gifted to receive you, Bud. What, in your opinion, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted Georgia Tech from your perspective?
Well, I guess aside from the issues related to the health and well-being of our campus community, of the faculty, the students, and the staff, there's some short-term impacts and some longer-term impacts. The short-term impacts, obviously, we several weeks before the end of the semester, about 2/3 of the way into the semester, we, like many other institutions across the country, eliminated on-campus courses and went to totally online. Georgia Tech was probably pretty well positioned for that. We've done a lot of online education and professional and distance education. About 6 years ago, we started an online master's program in computer science that today educates or provides about 10% of the masters of science in computer science in the country, and expanded that program into data analytics and cybersecurity. But still, it was a big change for us. I mean, if you'd have told Georgia Tech or University of Georgia or Georgia State that you wanted them to go to a situation where they teach all courses online, most universities would have set up a committee, done a task force, taken about a year to study the problem, do a 3-year implementation plan that would have cost a couple $100,000 or $1 million, and then but what all of us did, all of the institutions basically in the country, made that transition in about two weeks. So it was a huge change for higher education. Some of it went very smoothly, some of it was a little rough, but it was a tremendous disruptive change for institutions all across the country. In terms of research, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, we'll parlay into that because it's a fascinating fact, because we'd like to also discuss businesses and industries. So that from that perspective, from tech and the other schools throughout the state and the region, you thought that it was easy to make that pivot, or do you think that there was some pushback to it?
I don't think there was any pushback. I think people pretty much realized the necessity for having the students go off campus. Many institutions were kind of in the middle of spring break. For us, the recognition that there were some pretty serious issues with COVID-19 occurred the week before spring break. So we had a week to try to make some decisions. The University System of Georgia actually made the decision to terminate all on-campus classes and go to a completely virtual type of environment. It was a challenge for, I think, for all institutions, but and I'll mention this later, there were some upsides to it for both the students and for the universities and the faculty.
And with that, what is your impression, taking that and parlaying into how it impacted other businesses and industries throughout the perimeter and the rest of the regions of the state of Georgia?
Well, I think many of the implications are similar. There's the, we talked some about the budget implications at the universities. All of a sudden, we had students that were moving out of the residence halls, no dining service. We closed down the campus recreation center, and those things all had budgetary impacts. Businesses experienced many of the same things, the health and well-being, safety issues, issues with their employees. Probably one of the biggest changes or one of the biggest impacts for universities and for businesses, for universities, particularly in the research arena. We have some research that we do here at Georgia Tech that can be done virtually, where the graduate students and the faculty can work off campus, things, computational research, for example, and we have some things that really require physical presence, the work that's done in the Marcus Nanotechnology Center. I mean, you can't do that in your garage. You need the equipment and the clean rooms. All of the bio-related research requires physical presence and a lot of high-tech equipment. But there is some that can be done off campus. And I think the same was true for business. But the one thing they had in common is I think it helped us realize how important these personal interactions were, these face-to-face interactions that occur at universities and in business. At universities, we do a lot of things. Fundamentally, we do three things. We have the student to faculty interaction, and we've been doing that for 45 years. We used to send videotapes, courses, and mail VCR or beta. Some people might remember beta format videotapes that we'd send with lectures. So the faculty to student interaction has occurred for a long time. The student to student interaction, the second piece, actually we've seen a pretty significant transition, I don't know, I'd say in the past 10 to 12 years, but that's age dependent. I think the thing that's made distance learning so successful, and one of the reasons it's being adopted so widely, is the comfort level that young people have working and living in a virtual environment. I joke a little bit and say that I'm 67. I don't have any friends that I've never met, but the students have lots of friends that they've never met, and their comfort level. So that student-to-student exchange works pretty well. But the thing that's missing is this third piece. It's the interaction between people, the random touches that occur, the random discussions that occur on a campus or in a business where people just happen to have a conversation that might lead to new ideas or new products or new approaches to old problems. And that's the thing that kind of gets lost or got lost, both at universities and in the business community, I think.
Excellent. With that, what are your thoughts about the long-term, I'll say, implications to business and industries and or both from your perspective? And how do you fundamentally think things will change when we get back to what we'll call the quote new normal?
Yeah, well, I don't think we'll ever get back to the old normal. I think one of the reasons I say that is that I guess I'm confident that we'll soon learn whether having had COVID-19 provides some sort of immunity, whether it's long-term or short-term. I think we'll know that within the next several months, certainly. I'm confident that that folks, the scientists and researchers will develop a vaccine. It won't be anytime soon that it'll be available. I mean, that's a huge problem. You try to think about first, how did you develop the vaccine? And then how do you create 300 million? That's just 330 million. That's just the United States. I mean, trying to make 300 million of anything takes a long time. And you try to think about how long it's going to take the vaccine to be produced. But, you know, I think we'll get there. But the main reason I say that I'm not sure or don't think we'll return to the normal is that we've all changed. We've changed in a lot of ways. We've learned to live virtually, and while we have a lot that we can improve on. We can, you know, the way we interact in a virtual environment, we can all improve on that. I think what's happened is we've seen this rapid acceleration in people's comfort level and familiarity. Just think of the number of people that today know how to use Zoom or Blue Jeans or Microsoft Teams or you know, the technology that we're using today for this streaming discussion. A lot of people have learned to use that and have become familiar. I mean, at home, I'm actually in my office now because of the internet connection's better, but at home, I do a lot of video conferencing and communication. I've got a Zoom shirt. I kind of keep it by my desk, and when I'm going to have a conference call, I put on my Zoom shirt. And so I think there are a lot of 50 and 60-year-olds that today know how to communicate the way 15-year-olds do. And 3 months ago, they didn't. So a meeting like this is not uncommon for many people where again, 6 months ago would have been rather foreign. So, you know, it's accelerated our acceptance of technology and the use of that technology. I think a great example, people use things they're comfortable with.
Right.
And what this situation has done is forced us, many of us, to become comfortable with new technologies that were there. People were using them, but they weren't maybe as widely used as they are today. And telemedicine, I think, is a great example. People, physicians, patients, clinicians have been forced to use telemedicine because people don't want to go to the hospital because of the COVID-19 issues. And so people have used telemedicine, and we've seen that broad adoption of telemedicine and an acceptance by many physicians and many patients that, okay, this is okay, this can work. When you couple that with some of the changes in regulations, federal regulations, and some of the changes in payments, the way payments are handled, I think once COVID-19 the issues are resolved, if we have a vaccine and it becomes hopefully like polio or smallpox, I think we'll see people that will not return or will continue to utilize telemedicine because of the convenience, the cost structure, a whole host of issues, but most of all because of their comfort level.
And with that, and also I often think of the positive elements of how, from a telemedicine perspective, even in our own state, that rural communities who probably had shortages in hospitals and resources and so forth can utilize that. which brings me into a deeper conversation. What are your thoughts and perspective on the social impacts of COVID-19? You eloquently touched upon it. I'm looking at vis-a-vis early education, education at different levels, socioeconomic impacts, how it impacts healthcare coverage to employees, impacts to personal life, overall impacts to our community here, and the quality of life.
So an interesting question, and one we could spend a lot of time talking about, and there's a lot of varying positions on this, but I think it's pretty clear that COVID-19 has made a lot of people, including me, aware, and in some cases painfully aware of the socio-economic impacts of things like healthcare coverage, impacts to personal life. I think people now have a better understanding or a recognition of how fragile our economic system is. I think one obvious issue is food security. I personally, and I suspect that many other people are not too far from where I am, was not aware of how important a role the K through 12 educational system, the role that played in terms of food security and providing food to just hundreds of thousands of young people that didn't have access to good nutrition. You see all these cars lined up to get food at schools where the students used to participate in free lunch or reduced lunch or free breakfast and reduced breakfast programs. So the whole issue surrounding food security, sorry, didn't move enough, my light went off, technology. I think a second issue is the whole issue surrounding internet disparity, the disparity with internet connectivity, and how that impacts the remote or virtual teaching of the students. So when institutions of higher education went virtual, so did all the public schools. And I don't know that there was a broad societal awareness of how many people didn't have access to broadband in our state. And you saw shortly after that happened, Governor Kemp took some steps to try to address some of the issues. The technology, the laptops or iPads or iPhones, so that students could have access to the classroom. I mean, these public schools went virtual, but there were a whole host of students, a large number of students that didn't have access to either the broadband internet connectivity or the devices that they needed. And I have to say how pleased I was to see a number of companies and organizations step up and try to provide tablets or iPads or computers or laptops to some of the students so that they could have access and could continue their education. I think the socioeconomic disparity of COVID-19, that's been well discussed in the news, a clear issue. I think that we have a better understanding of that. And again, something that it kind of brought home to me was better understanding of the impact and ramifications of having health insurance tied to employment status. I mean, that's just kind of been the way things have been in this country for a long time for a lot of people. And when you have, I don't know, what are there, 30-some million people that are no longer employed or aren't employed today. Now, not all of those had health insurance tied to their employment, but a significant number did. So when they lose their job, they lose their health insurance. I think that those types of things have brought some of those issues home to us. And then again, people do things that they're comfortable with. And we become comfortable with the use of technology, at least those of us that have access to it. But there are a lot of people that don't have access to the technology that we're using today.
And from that point as well, what is your thought process on impacts of how the constituents of Georgia were impacted from a personal life perspective? Do you think it was an improvement, an adjustment, no difference, people acclimated to it?
That's an interesting question. I think all of the above, but I think there's a pretty strong correlation between income level and what that impact was. If you've got broadband access and you've got all the technology and devices that you need, you could figure out how to do this, how to make it work. You could use Zoom or Microsoft Teams, and you can connect with people. If you are in an economic situation where you didn't have access to that, didn't have health care, didn't have access to the internet, life became very challenging. So I think we saw, it's kind of like a rubber band. If you look at the socioeconomic spectrum and mark it on a rubber band, and then you stretch that rubber band, you kind of just see things where the haves have more and the have-nots have less.
Less. Absolutely. What are your thoughts on the long-lasting impacts for business or education, from a domicile perspective, and also from a perspective of other ways technology will or has already begun to impact returning to the new normal and to quote unquote brick and mortar type of properties?
So I think it'll be interesting and I'm sure some people will watch this and study it and track the numbers. But, when you think about, there's been a whole lot of parents who have been forced to homeschool their children. And I'm sure that some of those parents have thought that this was hugely successful and something that they may want to continue. And some of them probably are of a perspective that I don't want to do that again. For whatever reason, maybe they were 15, which is probably easier to homeschool given that I have 4 children that are all grown now. I can imagine that it's easier to homeschool an 8-year-old than a 15-year-old, both from subject matter and personality types of issues. But so maybe how will the number of people at homeschool change? But from a broader perspective, again, we've got a huge number of faculty and students that have now got some experience in online education. Some of those experiences were positive, and I'm sure some of them were not so positive. But for campuses like UGA, University of Georgia, or Georgia Tech that are largely residential, where we have 70% of our undergraduates that actually live here on campus, and most of the rest of them live within walking distance in Midtown or the surrounding communities. University of Georgia is a residential campus, a lot of students that live there, but we have a number of institutions in the university system of Georgia where students actually drive to take a class and then drive home. And as I mentioned, we do 3 things: the faculty to student interaction, the student to student interaction, and then what I think of as the other education, all of the things that that students get, which is why we send our kids to college. One of the reasons they learn to work together, to interact with people in different environments. They interact with people from different backgrounds. You can do the student to faculty interaction online, the student to student interaction online, but that third piece is really hard. But the students that are driving to campus to take a class and then driving home aren't getting that third piece now. And it may be that the demand for online classes, people say, you know what, this wasn't so bad. I can actually save the drive. I can save the costs associated with that. I can save the time. And so I think we'll see some adoption of virtual learning technologies. Again, that will have been accelerated by a number of years. That may be nationally. There's some folks that have postulated that we're going to see a decrease in the number of institutions nationally, that there's going to be some institutions that will become, I'll say, mega institutions. Some of those exist today. Arizona State University, for example, has 75,000 students that are residential in the Phoenix Scottsdale area, but they have 80,000 that are online, taking degree programs. And so that there may be institutions that grow their online programs and force some other institutions maybe to that the enrollments at those institutions go down.
This, to me, is always a fascinating subject. And we've had the honor and privilege of Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan being a visitor to the chamber and working with us in the forefront. And I know that the Innovation Task Force, which I believe, and please correct me, but you are on the lead from the technology perspective, which unequivocally was a brilliant and a very forward-looking assembly by Senator Johnny Isakson. And I know that you're also in the chair of that as well. Could you speak to that and how the coalition works together and the impact in some of the areas that you're looking for both the perimeter and the greater Atlanta and Georgia region?
Yeah, so last fall, Lieutenant Governor Duncan and his one of his right-hand folks, Mike Dudgeon, called me, and we had a number of conversations, and Lieutenant Governor Duncan said that he'd like to establish a task force to try to determine how Georgia could become the technology capital of the East Coast. We had a number of conversations. I told him that I grew up in Kansas, and I'm not sure that there's a lot of people west of the Mississippi that realize that Georgia is a coastal state. When they think of Georgia, they may not think of it as a coastal state, but nonetheless, the goal, I think, of this initiative is to try to make Georgia the technology capital of the East Coast. When we had those early discussions, he was very focused on a number of aspects. One was that this was a statewide initiative. This wasn't just about Atlanta, and he wanted to make sure that we focused from a statewide perspective. And the second thing that he was very emphatic about was that he wasn't interested in a long report and a bunch of PowerPoint presentations and a consulting report. He wanted a list of actionable items. What are some actions that he, as lieutenant governor, that the governor or the legislature could implement or enact, or business community could implement or enact that would help promote Georgia and the technologies of Georgia. It was interesting to me, and when we had the conversations, he alluded to this, that Georgia Tech was actually established to help move the state of Georgia from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. And I think his goal is to try to have this task force figure out how to move to an information type of economy, a technology economy. So he asked Senator Isakson and I if we would co-chair this, and we agreed to do that. And what we've done is set up really 4 subcommittees in 4 different areas. An education and training subcommittee that's co-chaired by Lori Durden, who's the president of Okeechee Technical College. So the technical college system is involved. Shan Cooper is currently the executive director of the Atlanta Committee for Progress, formerly was the chief executive officer at Lockheed up in Marietta. The second subcommittee is entrepreneurship and startups, focuses on entrepreneurships and startups. And Marty Flanagan, president and CEO of Invesco, and Paul Judge, who's the co-founder and executive chair of Pindrop and Tech Square Labs. He's a Morehouse undergrad, Georgia Tech PhD, and has started a number of companies. So he and Marty are working on entrepreneurships and startups. The Public Innovation Committee, so Raphael Bostic, who's the president and CEO of the Fed here in town and is very interested in public innovation, and Lynn Murphy, who is in Macon. She's the program director for the Knight Foundation, a philanthropic foundation that's very active nationally. And then the 4th committee is Rural Initiatives, and that's co-chaired by Paul Bowers, who's president and CEO of Georgia Power, and Barbara Rivera Holmes. Barbara is the president and chief executive officer of the Albany area Chamber of Commerce. She's also a member of the Board of Regents. So we've got the technical colleges represented, the regions represented. We've got people from rural Georgia, all across the state. Now, each of those four subcommittees identified their own membership. So there's, in some cases, up to 20 people from around the state that are involved with each of those subcommittees. And then Deborah Lamb, who works here at Georgia Tech, works with the Smart Communities program, and Jeb Stewart, who is a Tech alum, but he had some early conversations with Lieutenant Governor Duncan and Mike Dudgeon to talk about this. They've got another group that's working with them. So all in all, there's over 100 people that are involved in this initiative. They've been working diligently, meeting, the four subcommittees have been meeting in each of their respective areas. They've come forward with some early recommendations. We're in the process of triaging those. We're assisted by Javian and Kilpatrick Townsend are working with us to try to help work through this process. And our hope is to provide the Lieutenant Governor with a prioritized list of some key initiatives or key things that he could do, that we could do as a state, that would help move us towards this concept of technology capital of the East Coast. We're shooting for a final report to him by sometime in mid-July. This whole COVID thing has kind of changed. We've had to do a pivot. We started in January pre-COVID, and certainly things have changed, but there's a lot of things that, a lot of great ideas that have come out so far, and I'm excited to see what we come up with when we're all done.
So is it fair to say that throughout all of the regions within the state of Georgia, it will come together as one cohesive plan for the state to best address those areas?
Yeah. For example, how do we promote innovation and entrepreneurship across the state? Could we have some innovation hubs located regionally across the state that helps new businesses and startup? That's a thriving industry here in Atlanta. There's a lot of resources and a lot of things that are available. Atlanta Tech Village, David Cummings up north of here, Tech Square here right next to Georgia Tech, Tech Square Labs. There's a host of these. The Ponce City Market has a pretty thriving innovation hub there, but there's also some regionally located throughout the state. So how can we foster that? Broadband is a huge issue. Working with the Governor's Committee, Texas First, in terms of broadband, how do we improve broadband across the state? So that's something that I think Paul Bowers and Barbara Holmes are working on. And a key initiative that they'll come forward with is how can we improve that?
As part of that initiative, are there areas to the telehealth in sectors outside of the perimeter and in what I'll say more rural sections of Georgia where that's being addressed? Obviously, we have a broadband issue, and then we also have a resource issue in that vertical market.
Yeah, when you think about, I mentioned that the acceptance of telemedicine, I think we'll see a much, much greater acceptance, which has some pretty positive ramifications for rural Georgia, where they're having trouble getting access to healthcare. The numbers of physicians that are available in rural Georgia is fairly limited. And so that's, I'm sure one of the things that they'll be focusing on are what are some key actions, some specific initiatives that can or should be taken in order to improve access to high quality medical facilities across the state.
With that said, obviously the perimeter area, the city of Atlanta and the areas, Midtown, so forth, have always been very notorious through a lot of the stakeholders who started technology companies here, who brought also new ventures and likes or complements from the service perspective into those. How do you see COVID-19 impacting new ventures in technology and in other areas in the region, in the state, Dunwoody area? And additionally, what is the impact of those to the return to the workplace? What do you think that will look like when you come from a very innovative arena? You have a new venture perspective, which is obviously resources and then the funding capacity. Do you have a perspective on what that picture may look like?
Yeah, a lot of the institutions, University of Georgia, Georgia State, Kennesaw, Georgia Tech, all have initiatives within their institutions to try to help promote the growth and development of new business startups. I think one of the things that's going to come out of this whole COVID-19 issue is there's going to be a lot of ideas for new companies that are going to result from the things that people see happening and the needs. And you see some of that on the news, new companies that have and are being created to provide services. I think, I don't know, I'm not an entrepreneur. I've got some patents, but I've never started a business. On one hand, I think that there's some folks that may become a little more cautious and reserved in terms of starting new businesses. They may be a little hesitant because of some of the events and the economic status. There's going to be a reduction in the available venture capital, I suspect, as a result of the whole economic downturn. People may have a reluctance or resistance to think about starting new companies, but the experience I've had with entrepreneurs, they're not usually impacted by things like that. I was in Texas for 20 years, and when I moved to a lot of oil field business in Texas, and one of the things that always kind of I smiled at was what they refer to in Texas as a dry hole mentality, and that is these drillers, they go and drill a well and it's not a well, and they go, well, that one didn't work, let's try another one. And when I came to Atlanta and saw the startup community that existed here, the mentality is kind of the same. So I'm not sure how impacted some of these entrepreneurs are going to be by the current economic situation. It will impact the amount of venture capital that's available, but I don't know that I can predict or project exactly what will happen there.
If you don't mind, Bud, we have a few stakeholders in the community that sent the chamber some questions, if you don't mind addressing them. The first one is from Srini Duba. He's a tech CEO in the Dunwoody perimeter. And he would like to know your perspective and your thoughts on how companies and institutions need to adapt and or implement changes as relates to procedures, policy, infrastructure, and compliance in the post-COVID virtual work group environment. It's kind of procedure, policy, infrastructure, and compliance as that works hand in hand or independently in our new world.
I think what we'll see is a lot of these companies will hopefully take a step back and kind of see what are the changes that have been made because as a result of this COVID-19 and the issues related to it. What are the changes that have been made? What has worked and what has not worked? What are the policies that have been implemented, and should those policies be changed? I mentioned telemedicine. There have been some policy changes in telemedicine that have facilitated the adoption and use of that. Is that something we want to go back to? From a national perspective, you see it in terms of the approval process for vaccines and the testing. We've seen where reduction in the approval processes, some of which has been good and some of it has been not so good. But I think what we'll see is a lot of large companies and smaller companies looking at what have people done, what have companies done in order to adapt to what the situation we're in now, and what changes have worked, have been positive, what changes have not worked so well, and for those that haven't worked so well, how can we adapt or adjust those so that they to improve them?
And here is a question. This is a good one. Here's a question from two of your Hall of Fame, fellow Hall of Famers, Mr. Alan Eckerd and Dennis Hayes. And their question is, Bud, as you know, as a member yourself of the Technology Hall of Fame of Georgia, we have a group of Hall of Fame members who are working to set up a Hall of Fame team and process to provide advice and mentoring to potential entrepreneurs in Georgia. What do you believe to be the best way this team could work with Georgia Tech and the other Georgia universities and schools to be most effective, and also to other companies? That's a great question.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is another situation where this was a discussion that was going on kind of pre-COVID. And once the coronavirus issues impacted us, I think there was a bit of a pivot that occurred here. The Hall of Fame is a kind of a self-perpetuating body. They elect a member each year to the Georgia Technology Hall of Fame. I was fortunate enough several years ago to be elected to membership. And the thing that Dennis and kind of a small group of those individuals are trying to do is figure out how can they play a bigger role in facilitating the growth, economic growth and well-being of the state of Georgia. And one of the ideas that is currently being discussed is there's a lot of really smart, successful entrepreneurs, names that you'd recognize that are members of the Hall of Fame. Of course, Alan Ecker and Dennis Hayes, Hayes Modem. I think a lot of the folks that are my age can remember this noise from a modem.
The sound that changed the world.
Right. And then there's, people like Tom Noonan and Chris Klaus and the most recent inductee, David Cummings. So those people have a wealth of knowledge. And I think one of the things that is being discussed now is how can the experience and knowledge that those individuals have be leveraged to help continue to grow and expand the entrepreneurship startup community here in the state of Georgia. Again, UGA and Georgia State, Kennesaw, Georgia Tech, Augusta, all have programs where their faculty and students interact with the respective startup communities. They have different foci on entrepreneurship and innovation. But this group of experienced entrepreneurs that comprise the membership of the Hall of Fame have a wealth of expertise and knowledge, and I believe a willingness to try to help. And so how can we connect those? When you see places like Silicon Valley that are very successful in terms of new business startup, there's this whole ecosystem of experienced entrepreneurs and venture capitalists that all come together. So how can we try to create and use the wealth of knowledge that exists within the Hall of Fame members and get them in touch with the startup community to further enhance and develop this startup mentality?
And many of those individuals were the beginning entrepreneurs who were highly successful, and I can name quite a few technology companies and like software companies in even the Dunwoody perimeter area that without the Hall of Famers and what they accomplished in earlier years may not have existed.
Yeah. So this group has already set up a Facebook page, a LinkedIn group, and a Twitter account, which is going to be, those are pretty much necessities to try to interact with this startup community. So it's still in development. I know Dennis and Alan and a whole group of folks, you're involved, Shirley, in this, and trying to think about how can we leverage the experience and expertise of these folks and make it available to people with new ideas for new businesses and new companies.
Excellent. But if it is all right with you, sir, I am going to open the floor from some questions from members and stakeholders that we're beginning to receive. Is that acceptable to you?
Sure. Okay. Don't ask me any hard ones.
All right, here come the glasses. No, that's not going to work. All right. Hi, Bud. And this is from, and Christian, if I do not pronounce your last name correctly, please forgive me. It's Doesch, and it's Doetsch. And the question is, hi, Bud. I am a current Dunwoody resident and recent Georgia Tech grad. That's an awesome thing. CS, computer science. She graduated in the year 2013. We were happy to have you as our president while I was at Tech, and happy to see you on Facebook live streaming this morning to hear your thoughts on COVID-19. So that's a shout out from one of your former students. We have another question from Brittany Hardaware. How do you see Georgia Tech and other schools moving forward in the fall in the midst of all this, and what will be the procedure to do so?
Well, I think the procedure to do so is fairly straightforward. There's an article in the AJC, several recent articles that talk about that situation. My impression is and belief is that this will be a decision that's made by the University System of Georgia. That's how the decision to cancel all on-campus classes was made. So the university presidents, from what the newspaper says, are having some conversations with the chancellor and his team. They'll make a decision. There have been several universities or systems nationwide that have already made a determination. The Cal State system has said they're not going to hold on-campus classes. University of Arizona has said they are, and Purdue, President Mitch Daniels has indicated that Purdue's going to have on-campus classes, but they're going to do kind of on-campus classes, virtual classes, and hybrid classes, from what I understand. So I think the process is this will be a decision that's made statewide, not by individual institutions, but I could be wrong there. In terms of how that impacts, there's certainly budgetary and financial implications associated with that. There's issues around students that have been accepted. Will they want to come back? Will they continue their enrollment? Will they take a gap semester? I think that's one of the things that nationally people are wondering is what is the enrollment at colleges and universities going to actually look like in the fall semester? And I think a lot of that has to do with what happens between now and then. There's a lot of things that could happen. We're all watching the curve to see what's happening on states as they reopen. So I think it's too early to tell, but a huge complicated issue. There's a type of problem that people refer to. It's referred to as a wicked problem. And that's a problem for which there's no easy or obvious solution. And this is clearly a wicked problem. It's one of those things where there's some issues if you do this, there's some issues if you do that. But there's a lot of really smart people that are working on this, and we'll just have to kind of wait and see what happens.
I think we have come to conclusion of time, but I want to thank you. We appreciate your time. You are a great leader of our community. The sacrifice and genuine commitment to Georgia, not only with Georgia Tech, but what you do with the governors and your concerted effort, and just being a genuine stakeholder. Your constituents really appreciate that. We at the Chamber look forward to always working with you. And we cannot thank you enough. So we're going to conclude this, Dr. Peterson's conversation. You can also go to our website at the Perimeter Chamber to also see the tape. Our next segment, which is actually our first session, is going to be held on May 28th. It is reopening the workplace. And for registration and information on how to attend, it will be the same format. It is at perimeterchamber.com. And Bud, if you will bear with me one moment, Katie Reynolds said, "Hello, Dr. Peterson. I'm a current Georgia Tech student, BA 2021, and an intern at State Farm." Oh, well, another great stakeholder of the community. Welcome, Katie. And she just wanted to personally thank you for your time. And it was great hearing from you. As we will all agree, it is always great to hear from you, Bud.
Thank you. And thanks to Katie. Good luck with your internship. And thank you, Shirley. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you again, Bud.
Take care. Be safe.
You
Wash
as
your
well.
hands.
I will.